Hello, my name is Danny Bega. I'm a movement disorders neurologist and the director of the Huntington's Disease Society of America Center of Excellence at Northwestern in Chicago. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about insights into Huntington's disease chorea, provider, patient, and care partner perspectives. This promotional program was developed by Teva in conjunction with therapeutic experts, and I'm presenting on behalf of Teva. I've received compensation from Teva to make this presentation. First, I'm going to review today's agenda. We're going to begin by discussing Huntington's disease, and I'm going to specifically talk about chorea and the impact that chorea has on people living with Huntington's disease. Next, we'll talk about management of chorea related to Huntington's disease. And we have a real treat today. We're going to be including patient and care partner, James and Sue McGann. James is living with Huntington's disease, and Sue is his care partner. And they're going to share their experience with chorea and with managing chorea. So to start off, let's talk about Huntington's disease. Huntington's was first described by George Huntington in the late 1800s. It wasn't called Huntington's disease yet at that time. He was an American physician, and he had made some observations in the late 1800s that he saw abnormal movements in people and noticed that they seemed to be running in families. And so he described hereditary choreas, which we now know to be Huntington's disease. So after George Huntington described hereditary choreas in the late 1800s, the timeline for the development of what we've now learned about HD, we can see that there are a few landmark times in this timeline here. The first point on this timeline is in the 50s and 60s, where HD first had to be recognized more widely, and HDSA was developed and kind of gave HD a reputation that people became aware of it. It wasn't until 1993, though, that the gene for where the mutation in HD occurs was finally fully sequenced and identified and became testable. It was then in 2008 that the first FDA-approved drug to manage HD chorea was approved, and then later in 2017 when the second FDA-approved drug for HD chorea was approved. Huntington's disease pathobiology is not exactly understood, but let's go over what we do know. First of all, we know that the gene responsible for Huntington's disease is on chromosome 4. That is a gene that codes for an important protein called the Huntington protein, which is present in different tissues of the body, including, of course, the brain. And we know that that's the gene that's mutated in people who develop Huntington's disease. And the mutation that happens is that the gene, which is coded with a string of what we call CAG repeats, repeats itself too many times. And essentially, this means that the recipe for making the protein is abnormally expanded. And when that happens, the protein can't form normally. We know that when that repeat happens at 35 times or more, that someone is going to get Huntington's disease at some point in the future because of an abnormally formed Huntington protein. And later that protein, as it builds up in the neurons in the brain, leads to destruction of those neurons or deterioration of those neurons. And that is why this is a degenerative disease or a progressive loss of neurons in the brain. This leads to chorea, which is the most common symptom seen in Huntington's disease. And let's look at how common Huntington's is in general. So we consider Huntington's disease a rare disease, but among rare diseases, it's not that rare. You can look at the estimated prevalence in the US, which is thought to be about 30 to 40,000 people that are affected by HD, and that may even be an underestimate depending on the study that you look at. The average duration of disease is somewhere from 15 to 20 years, with the average age of onset being around 40 years of age. Now, there's a big spectrum of when people can develop HD symptoms, anywhere from childhood and adolescence to really late in life. And what's shown in this graph on this slide is, first of all, you can see the age of onset of motor symptom onset graphed on one side, and the other side is the length of the mutation of the CAG repeats. And first thing I'll point out is just the wide spectrum of ages that people can get HD, although again, the average tends to cluster around 40. The other thing that's noticed here is that there's an association between longer CAG repeats being related to earlier ages of onset and shorter CAG repeats being associated with later ages of onset. And that's what this graph is mapping. But the other thing about that, and while we can say that there are general trends between the CAG repeat length and the age of onset, we can't predict an individual's age of onset from their CAG repeat length because we see that there's a lot of variability of age of onset for any particular CAG repeat length. And that's shown with these circles. These are individual ages of onset for any particular CAG repeat length, and they vary a lot around that line. HD causes a triad of symptoms, and we're going to focus most of the talk on chorea, but I also want to point out that we call this a triad because motor symptoms like chorea are one part of the triad. But there are also cognitive problems and dementia that develops. And then there can be emotional and behavioral problems. And this is why we manage Huntington's disease with a multidisciplinary team approach, often with both neurologists and psychiatrists, social workers and genetic counselors being involved in managing this triad of problems that people can have to different degrees from person to person. So before we talk more about the chorea, let's just point out one important symptom, which is depression and suicidal ideation, which are really common in Huntington's disease and very important that we address and we ask about and pay attention to because up to even 25% of people with Huntington's disease may have had or have a suicide attempt in their life. Chorea, though, is these abnormal movements that I'm going to talk about, is the most common presenting symptom in Huntington's disease. Now, I mentioned cognitive and mood behavioral problems, which can be present at any point in the disease, but research has shown that those symptoms can be present even before the motor symptoms, even before the diagnosis. For even up to 15 years, there can be some more mild cognitive or mood symptoms that people may experience. As the disease begins from a motor standpoint and as it progresses, people decline gradually over that 15 to 20 year period that I discussed. Particularly losing more functional abilities. And that functional decline, we characterize as early, middle, and late stages of disease as people become more functionally impaired. Now, the symptoms can be present to different degrees in different people and at different stages, but the chorea itself is the most common in the middle stage of disease, although again, it can be present in any of the stages. And each person's experience with HD is going to be unique and different. So now I'm going to talk about chorea and how it impacts people. So first, let's talk about where chorea originates from. What we think is that most movement disorders like chorea originate deep in the brain, and the neurons that are most affected are those that are in the area called the basal ganglia, which is shown in blue in this picture and is deep in the brain. Now, HD affects a great deal of the brain, but the reason we're focusing on the basal ganglia is because movement problems tend to originate from there. And there are particularly cells called medium spiny neurons, which we know are really impacted in Huntington's disease. And the degeneration of those cells and those neurons in the basal ganglia, those medium spiny neurons, leads to an imbalance in the way dopamine pathways facilitate movement. So dopamine is a chemical in our brains that facilitates normal movement. And when it's out of whack or imbalanced, when there's either too much or too little signaling in the dopamine system, that can lead to too much or too little movement. And in the case of Huntington's disease, what we find is that there's a loss of inhibition, of essentially a brakes on the movement. And those cells that would normally put a brakes on movement are being lost. And that leads to excessive movements, what we call hyperkinetic movements. And that's the characteristic movement of Huntington's disease, or known as chorea. These are involuntary movements, which are seen in nearly 90% of people with Huntington's disease at some point in their course. And it can be present in any part of the body. So shown in this figure, you can see pointed out the face, the mouth, the arms, the legs, and the trunk. So really any part of the body can be affected by chorea. And so again, to go over what that movement is, it's a involuntary, jerky, random, flowing movement, often from one body part to another, that is an excessive movement. And so some people do describe it as fidgeting. It tends to be more dramatic than just basic fidgeting that people may have, but it may start with fidgeting and become more noticeable. And again, it can be in any part of the body, irregular, continuous, fleeting movements from one area to another. It can change throughout the day. It can change when someone is more fatigued or more stressed. They may have more. People may at times be able to partially suppress it, and at other times may not be that aware that they're even doing it. And it may interfere with different activities, which I'll talk about in a moment. It can be socially bothersome to people, but it can be physically impairing for day-to-day function. We can actually rate the chorea severity. One of the ways we do this, and this is relevant because this is a rating scale that's also used in clinical trials to look at the effects of drugs, is we use a score called the total maximal chorea score. And this is essentially rating these 7 different regions that are shown in green here in this graph. And it's rating each of those regions from 0 to 4, where 0 is no chorea at all, and 4 is marked or prolonged chorea. And so on that rating of severity, it can get a maximum anywhere from 0 to a maximum of 28 points on severity, with higher numbers indicating more severe chorea. We'll come back to that score when we talk about the clinical trials for managing drugs to manage chorea. First, I do want to talk about the impact of chorea. There are many functional consequences to HD chorea. So I mentioned briefly that there can be social impact, that people may be bothered socially by it, or that care partners may be distressed seeing a family member having chorea. There are also physical limitations that chorea can result in. And we know that the progression of HD is characterized by functional decline in day-to-day tasks. And so performing fine motor tasks can be one way that chorea can impact people. Trouble with walking and running because of center of gravity being thrown off because of chorea in the body, trouble doing work or participating in leisure and sport activities, trouble performing day-to-day things at home, trouble with driving. And so you can imagine lots of different impacts of having irregular hyperkinetic movements of the body. It can even lead to self-injury and can be associated with placement in long-term care. Now, as we'll talk about managing HD chorea, there's no evidence that treating the chorea specifically impacts these outcomes, because these were not the outcomes that were looked at in the trials. But these are outcomes that are associated, these are functional limitations that are associated with having chorea. I'm going to give you some visual examples of how HD chorea can affect people's day-to-day life, because I think it's important as we discuss this. In my day-to-day interactions with my patients, I don't just ask, do you have chorea and are you bothered by chorea? I ask about specific day-to-day tasks, and I try and figure out if chorea might be impacting some of these tasks. Let's see how that can happen. So first I'm going to show you how chorea might impact someone trying to get dressed and their fine motor abilities, and I'm going to play a video right now. So what I saw in that video was that that lady was struggling to button her coat, and I saw extra movements in her arms and in her body that seemed to be impacting her ability to get that button into the hole. Let's look at another example of how this might affect day-to-day function. We'll look at someone walking and how chorea could impact their balance. So what I noticed in that video was I did see some fidgeting in his hands. That was chorea that I saw in his hands. But more importantly for his walking, I saw that he couldn't keep a straight line as he was walking because his center of gravity seemed to be thrown off center, and it was making his body sway away from the center of that line. Next, let's look at a really important day-to-day task, eating and drinking, and how abnormal movements might impact that. So eating and drinking is obviously a very basic and important task, and it can be very difficult to watch someone struggling with their eating and drinking. And here I saw abnormal movements, chorea in the mouth and face. I would be wondering as the physician, if I was seeing this patient, if it's impacting the swallowing also. We know swallowing can be a problem in Huntington's disease. Not always because of chorea, but I would be worried about that. And just the coordination of getting the food in the cup to the mouth can be affected by abnormal movements. And then lastly, let's look at the impact on writing. And once again, I noticed in this video abnormal movements of the body, but I also noticed abnormal movements of the face, although that wasn't the focus on this video. There was chorea in the face. There were also movements of the shoulders and the arms. And you can imagine that handwriting was not legible. And I imagine that's because of abnormal movements in the hands causing jerking and inability to keep the hand steady when he's writing. So I'll just point out one last point is, as we talk about managing HD chorea, is that, again, we're going to talk about reducing chorea with medication. There's not specific evidence that treating the chorea affects these outcomes that I just showed you, the dressing and walking and eating and handwriting. Those were not the outcomes that were looked at specifically in the studies. In terms of how bothersome the chorea is to people, patients with HD and their care partners were surveyed asking about what was the most bothersome symptom to them related to their HD. And actually, you can see here highlighted that both patients and caregivers rated chorea or abnormal movements and balance issues as among the most bothersome and impactful symptoms of HD. For care partners, you can see it was actually the most of all of the symptoms listed in this graph. 30% of caregivers and then 18% of patients perceived chorea, movement, balance problems as the most impactful symptom of their HD. I think that it's also interesting to note that the care partners rated it higher than the patients. And why might that be? And so this is something that I've experienced in my interactions with people living with HD is sometimes there's this, what we call anosognosia, or lack of insight that can occur as a result of the disease itself and the way that the disease affects some of the cognitive and awareness centers. And it can make it so that someone living with an abnormal movement might not always be aware of it or complain about it. And it's hard for us observing the person to believe that they might not notice it, but that can happen. And so they may not complain about it. And that may be why care partners rate it more severe than patients in some cases. But if you ask about the impact, sometimes you might get into more of the way it is affecting people. If you ask about trouble with day-to-day tasks as a result of it, or balance issues as a result of it, that can be getting a sense of how it may be impacting them, even if they're not aware of the movements themselves. But as a result of this, sometimes patients don't feel like they want to be treated or need to be treated because they may not be that aware of their abnormal movements. And so this needs to be a discussion that happens with the doctor, with the patient, and the care partner as well. It can lead to delays in treating it, though, because the person living with it may not always bring it up. So ways that we may need to understand the chorea instead of simply asking, do you have bad chorea, is we ask about physical injury that might be as a result of the chorea. We ask, is it interfering with work? Or is it impacting your ability to take care of day-to-day tasks? Are you needing more help with things because of the clumsiness or the abnormal movements that the chorea results in? Is it affecting your sleep or your balance? Is it leading to social isolation? Is it making you not want people to see you because of the abnormal movements? Is it leading to stigma for you or your family members? So these are things that need to be assessed at least on a yearly basis with your care team. So despite the impact of chorea on daily life, we find that HD chorea actually still remains undertreated. And in a survey that was done in 2016 of people and caregivers living with HD, 23% of respondents reported taking tetrabenazine for management of chorea. A quarter of people said that their chorea medication was working not very well or not at all at that time. And 40% of people who responded to the survey said that they were unaware of or not utilizing any medication to manage their HD chorea. Treating HD chorea early can impact people's lives. And so it's one of the reasons that we want to try and manage it. And when treating chorea, the benefits of the medication need to outweigh the risks. And so we'll talk about potential benefits and potential risks to managing HD chorea. We're going to talk about specifically a drug called Austedo to manage HD chorea. That transitions us to talking about Austedo, how Austedo may help manage Huntington's disease chorea. So as I talk about Austedo, you're going to hear me talk about what we know about the potential benefits. You're also going to hear what we know about potential side effects, and we're going to be balanced in our discussion about it. But most usefully, I think you're going to also hear from a person living with HD, managing their chorea, and we'll hear a personal story there. So the information that I'm going to be presenting about Austedo is consistent with the full prescribing information for Austedo that is applicable to the FDA regulations. I'm only going to stick to talking about the FDA approved indication for Austedo, and additional information can be found on the website at www.austedo.com. So firstly, Austedo is indicated for the treatment of chorea associated with Huntington's disease. So what this means is it's not indicated for the treatment of the disease. It's indicated for the treatment of the chorea, the symptom, the movement problem that's associated with Huntington's disease. There are actually two approved indications for Austedo. We're only going to talk about one of them today, and that is the chorea or involuntary movements associated with HD. The other indication for Austedo is for a condition called tardive dyskinesia, which we're not going to talk about today. It's not known if Austedo is safe and effective in children, and it has not been studied in children. So first, I'm going to start with an important safety information warning. I had mentioned earlier that depression and suicidal ideation is an important thing that we monitor for and pay attention to in HD. And so one of the warnings to pay attention to with Austedo is being careful about monitoring for worsening depression or suicidal ideation. And in particular, if someone has poorly controlled depression or active suicidal ideation, then Austedo should not be used in a person like that. In general, we should be monitoring for mood symptoms and suicidal ideation in people who take Austedo. So I'm going to talk about how chorea symptoms can be improved with a VMAT2 inhibitor, and Austedo is a VMAT2 inhibitor. So going back to my initial description of dopamine and its effects on movement, remember I said that dopamine is a chemical that facilitates movement, and excessive dopamine signaling leads to excessive movement. The loss of the brakes or the loss of the inhibition of the dopamine signaling leads to excessive movement. And so we need to keep that in balance for normal movement. First, before dopamine can act to facilitate a movement, it needs to be packaged and then released in order to have its action occur. What VMAT is it's a transporter that allows dopamine to be packaged so that it can then be released. And a VMAT2 inhibitor would then block the packaging of dopamine, and so therein less dopamine gets released to facilitate movement. This results in a decrease in movement as a result of less dopamine being released. I'm going to show a video that goes into that in more detail now.
Maintaining a balance in the level of dopamine is essential for controlled movement. Dopamine signaling is facilitated by vesicular monoamine transporter 2, or VMAT2, which transports monoamines, including dopamine, from the cytosol into synaptic vesicles, keeping them ready for subsequent release in response to an action potential. When an action potential reaches the nerve terminal of the presynaptic neuron, dopamine is released from the synaptic vesicles into the synaptic cleft. This dopamine binds to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, thereby signaling movement. Excess dopamine signaling manifests as abnormal involuntary movements. Austedo, deutetrabenazine, is a VMAT2 inhibitor. Deutetrabenazine contains deuterium, a naturally occurring heavy version of hydrogen. Deuterium forms stronger molecular bonds with carbon atoms, thereby extending the half-life of therapeutic metabolites. The precise mechanism by which deutetrabenazine exerts its effects on abnormal involuntary movements is unknown. It is believed to be related to its effect as a reversible depleter of monoamines, including dopamine, from nerve terminals. Deutetrabenazine binds to VMAT2 on the vesicle in the presynaptic neuron and inhibits the uptake of dopamine into synaptic vesicles. Dopamine molecules collect outside the blocked VMAT2 and are degraded by monoamine oxidase. Reducing dopamine levels in the presynaptic neuron results in less dopamine signaling to the postsynaptic neuron. Limiting dopamine signaling is believed to lead to fewer abnormal involuntary movements.
Austedo is a deuterated drug, and it's the first deuterated drug approved by the FDA. So what is the deuterated drug? And I had never heard of deuteration until I learned about Austedo. So if we look at the molecule of Austedo, the chemical formation of it looks like, it is similar in its appearance to a previous drug that exists called tetrabenazine, but a hydrogen is replaced here by a molecule called deuterium. Now, deuterium is a molecule that forms really strong bonds with carbon. And what that means is that it affects the way it's metabolized and the way it exists in the bloodstream. And so if we look at tetrabenazine, the drug that was FDA approved prior to Austedo, this is what its curve of its effects in the bloodstream look like and its concentrations in the bloodstream looks like. It has this peaking here in yellow, and then where you can see where it starts to wear down. But because of the deuteration with Austedo, these strong bonds that it forms and affects the metabolism of it, what we can see with essentially a half of the number of milligrams in Austedo is that the same area under the curve is covered, or a similar area under the curve is covered, in that the exposure to the drug with a smaller number of milligrams actually has a larger exposure and a longer duration of effect in the bloodstream. So compared with tetrabenazine, Austedo results in the desired overall exposure that we're looking for with a lower, what's known as a lower Cmax, or the maximum level, which is associated more with where people tend to be more likely to get side effects, that is less at half the dose. So additional safety information to pay attention to. You should not take Austedo if you have, I mentioned this as a warning before, if you have actively uncontrolled depression or suicidal thinking. You should not take Austedo if you have liver problems, or if you're taking certain classes of drugs that fall under the class of monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or reserpine. You should also not take Austedo if you are on other drugs that have VMAT inhibiting effects, such as tetrabenazine or valbenazine. Next, I'm going to talk about the clinical trial that led to the FDA approval of Austedo. And this is called FIRST-HD. FIRST-HD, or first time use of deutetrabenazine in Huntington's disease. This was a phase 3 trial of Austedo tablets for the treatment of chorea associated with Huntington's disease. This slide shows the design of the trial. So what happened in this trial was people with HD experiencing chorea were randomly assigned to receive Austedo or placebo. 45 of them received Austedo and 45 of them received placebo. The first 8 weeks was a titration to the effective dose for them. So they started at 6 milligrams once a day or placebo. And then week by week, that dose was increased, first to 6 milligrams twice a day, then to 9 milligrams twice a day, and so forth, up into a maximum of 48 milligrams per day, or placebo. And the dose that they were kept at was the dose that was able to either control their chorea or improve their chorea, or the maximum dose if they were not getting benefit. And after that, they remained on that dose or on the placebo. And the chorea severity score was rated at week 9 and at week 12. And they looked to see if there was an improvement in the chorea severity score compared to the baseline chorea severity score. The score they used was the one I went over before, which was the rating of all the different body parts from 0 to 4, with a score ranging from 0 to 28, where higher numbers mean more severe chorea. So again, these are the endpoints of the trial. Their primary goal was the total maximal chorea score, and to look to see if that improved at week 9 and week 12 compared to the placebo when comparing it to their baseline or when they entered the study. They also looked at a few other things outside of their primary goals. They looked at the effect in the eyes of the clinician and in the eyes of the person experiencing the chorea, and they asked them to rate whether they felt like they saw improvement. And so we'll look at that as well. And they also looked at participants' limitations in performing daily activities. We talked about the impact of chorea on daily activities. Now, I mentioned that's not the primary goal of this study, but that was looked at as well. And then side effects were also looked at, tolerability was looked at, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So first, let's see who was involved in the study. In terms of the characteristics of the patients who entered this study, you can see the average age was around 53. About 55% were men. The average weight is listed here. The average CAG repeat length was 43.9. The average total motor chorea score was 12.6. And remember, this is from a range of 0 to 28, where 28 is the most severe and 0 means no chorea. So the average entering the study was around 12.6. And over half of people in the study were using antidepressants. There were no significant differences between the group that was assigned randomly to get the Austedo versus the group that was assigned randomly to getting the placebo. And this was the main outcome of the study. And so what we're seeing here is the total maximal chorea score. On the top line, you're seeing in gray the placebo group. And on the bottom line, you're seeing in purple the group who was assigned to Austedo. At week 0, that's their baseline score. I mentioned that was somewhere around 12. And what you're seeing is their score in purple going down or improving. And you can see their main endpoint there at week 9 and at week 12, where there's a separation between the purple and the gray lines, because the group that's receiving the Austedo is showing improvement. So that's statistically significant improvement more than the group that's receiving the placebo. What you're seeing also at week 12 is when they stop the medication, that purple line goes up again, meaning their chorea starts to return or increase again when the drug is stopped. So the actual numbers here, Austedo reduced the total maximal chorea score by 4.4 points compared to only 1.9 points in the placebo group, and that was statistically significant. The total maximal chorea score was reduced by 21% with Austedo compared to placebo. And then after that washout, which means when the drug was stopped, that total maximal chorea score returned to baseline. So that again, what that shows us is that it's not treating the disease itself, it's controlling the chorea. And proof that it was improving the chorea is that when you remove the drug, it then gets worse again. One thing that's important to look at is, because those are averages, we want to look at the distribution of, there are some people that get less benefit and some people that get more benefit, and that's how averages, of course, are made. But approximately 33% of people in the Austedo group had a 6-point or greater improvement in the total maximal chorea score, compared with only 2% of people on the placebo group. And so thinking about those people, 6 points or greater, where the average at baseline for people was around 12, thinking about whether that is meaningful or not, I think that gives us a sense of that. The other way we can look at the impact is rating the clinicians and the people living with the chorea and asking them if they're noticing the difference, not just the rating scale, but subjectively when surveyed, are they seeing an improvement? This is called the global impression of change. So when the patient global impression of change is looked at, you can see that 51% of people who participated said that they felt that their chorea was much or very much improved, compared to only 20% who received placebo. And that was statistically significant. When you ask the clinicians, the neurologists rating them, about 42% of the physicians reported that they felt that there was much or very much improvement in the HD symptoms, compared to only 13% on the placebo. Let's again look at some safety information. So additional things that we want to pay attention to and watch out for when people are on Austedo is looking at any impact on the heart rate or the heartbeat, something called QT prolongation, which is something we can see on an EKG. Want to monitor people for a dangerous but rare condition called neuroleptic malignant syndrome. We want to ask about and look for issues with internal restlessness or feeling uncomfortable internally. And then we want to look for Parkinsonism, which is a suggestion of a dopamine deficiency, where people can become slow and stiff and shuffle their feet when they walk. And so these are things we watch out for. But when we actually look at the side effects that were seen in the trial itself, the most common adverse reactions that were seen in the first HD trial reported in greater than or equal to 4% of people on Austedo. That's shown in this table here. So the first column, actually the middle column here in this table, you're looking at the Austedo group. And in the column on the right, you're looking at the placebo group and looking at the difference in the side effects that were seen in the study. So the most common side effect in the Austedo group was somnolence or sleepiness, seen in 11% of people on Austedo compared to 4.4% on placebo. After that, the next most common side effects that were seen were diarrhea, dry mouth, fatigue. Those were the four most common side effects seen in Austedo compared to placebo. After that, the additional side effects are listed for you here in this table. In terms of discontinuation of the drug because of side effects, there was one person, which came out to 2%, in both the Austedo and in the placebo groups, who stopped the treatment because of side effects. And dose reduction was needed in 3 patients, or 7% of people in the Austedo group and the placebo group, so in both groups. And then one patient taking Austedo, compared to none in the placebo, had thoughts of suicide during the study, but not a suicide attempt. Additionally, when we looked at safety and tolerability, both in the starting of the drug and then in the maintenance phase, or staying on the stable dose of the drug, things that were looked at, things like internal restlessness, we call that akathisia, or internal agitation. That was seen in 4% of people on Austedo and 2% of people in the placebo group. So people in placebo groups tend to also get some side effects, so that's why we compare the two. Suicidal ideation was reported by 2% of people on Austedo compared to none on placebo. And again, no suicide attempts or completed suicides were seen in the study. In terms of comparing the titration period, or the initiation of the drug, to the maintenance period, which is when they're on a stable dose of the drug, Parkinsonism, akathisia or restlessness, suicidal ideation were not reported during the titration period. They were reported in less than 4% of people in both arms during the maintenance phase, so meaning both the drug and the placebo arms. Anxiety was reported in less than 4% of people in both arms during the titration and maintenance period. And then once patients were titrated to their maintenance dose and they were on the stable dose, somnolence, diarrhea, dry mouth, and fatigue, which were the 4 most common side effects seen, those were no longer reported. So those were seen mainly in the titration period, but not in the maintenance period for this trial. Practical things to consider for managing HD chorea with Austedo. First of all, some people who will end up on Austedo may be already on tetrabenazine. We don't have direct comparisons in terms of a study that directly compares tetrabenazine to Austedo, but we do have a study called ARC-HD, which was an overnight switchover from tetrabenazine to Austedo. And what we learned from that was that people in that study were able to be switched overnight to half the number of milligrams that they were on if you compare the tetrabenazine dose to the Austedo dose. For instance, a tetrabenazine dose of 42 milligrams per day was converted overnight to 20 milligrams per day of Austedo without any change in the effects on chorea at half the number of milligrams. And so typically that's the recommendation if someone is being switched over, is to half the dose and do an overnight switch. Additional side effects to comment on, I mentioned sleepiness or sedation. That was the most common side effect seen in 11% of people on Austedo. So don't drive a car or operate machinery or do anything that you might regret being sleepy during until you know how it affects you. The most common side effects I mentioned in the HD trial, the 4 that I mentioned were the most common, were sleepiness, diarrhea, tiredness, and dry mouth. There was another study of Austedo for a different indication, which I mentioned, called tardive dyskinesia. And in that study, the side effects that were most common were nose and throat irritation and problems with sleeping or insomnia. These are not all the possible side effects that can be seen with Austedo, and so you definitely want to talk to your doctor if you experience any side effects. You're encouraged to report any side effects that you have to the FDA. So Austedo comes in 3 different dosage tablets. It comes in 6 milligram, 9 milligram, and 12 milligram tablets. The initiation of Austedo happens as a 6 milligrams once a day dose. And then after that, each week it's increased until people achieve control of their chorea. First to 6 milligrams twice a day, then to 9 milligrams twice a day. Each week is increased by 6 milligrams per day, but it's divided into twice a day dosing. So it's taken morning and evening with meals. And it's taken with meals because that has an effect on the way it's absorbed. It's not to be crushed or chewed. Tablets are meant to be swallowed whole. So just to summarize a few of the key points that I covered today. Austedo provides statistically significant improvements in the total motor chorea score compared to placebo in that first HD trial. There are higher rates of treatment success recognized by both the physician and the person living with the chorea compared to the people who were getting the placebo group. So they reported improvements. The most common adverse reactions were sleepiness or somnolence, diarrhea, dry mouth, and fatigue. And we need to balance the risks of depression and suicidality, which are already risks in HD to begin with, as we're balancing that against the potential for benefits with a treatment for chorea. And I mentioned the warning about not using it in people who have uncontrolled depression or suicidal thinking. And then lastly, I mentioned that it has 3 different dosage pills that it comes in, and it's titrated to the effective dose. And so what that means is it has the most FDA-approved dosing options or flexibility of adjusting to the dose that any particular individual person may need and to any particular tolerability threshold that an individual person may need from week to week. And then lastly, how you can get the medication if it's appropriate for you. Teva has a program called Shared Solutions. And Shared Solutions works with both the person who is receiving the drug as well as the clinician who's prescribing the drug. They work to help with financial assistance, and they also work with nursing support and education to the patient and to the clinics to make sure that we can navigate the experience of getting the right person the drug and making sure that it's affordable and manageable. And so that concludes the formal part of the presentation. And at this point, what I want to do is I want to bring in James and Sue McGann. And James is a person living with HD, dealing with and managing chorea, and Sue is his care partner. And they're going to give us, real life insights into what it's like to live with HD and to manage chorea directly from their experience.
We're sharing our experience today, our personal experience on behalf of Teva. I also want to share that we are being compensated for sharing our story for Teva, for the time we're spending. And the information that we're sharing is based on our personal experience and goes along with all the prescribing information for Austedo.
James and Sue, first of all, I want to thank you for joining us today and for being open to sharing your story. First, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself to us and telling us just first about your experience with first being diagnosed with HD and how that came to be, how you first found out about HD.
I'm Sue McGann. I'm the caregiver to James McGann. I am currently the chapter president of the Huntington Disease Society of America and the Connecticut chapter president. I got involved in volunteering for Huntington's about in 2007 when James's sister passed with Huntington's disease.
I'm James McGann. I have Huntington's disease. It's in my family. My mom had it. I did test positive at a later age than most people, late 50s. But, I certainly am. It's a challenge, but you do want to keep a positive attitude and make the most out of every day. Well, I noticed I had movements in my toe, and that was about 10 years ago. I wasn't surprised because I already had tested positive for HD prior to that, a few years prior to that. I took the test without having any symptoms.
When you talk about symptoms, I'm assuming you're talking about chorea. Could you explain for us what chorea is? Like, how do you experience that? How would you best describe it to people who don't really know what it is?
It's an uncontrolled movement. It could be a twitch. It could be like my mother had very upper body violent kind of movements. You would think she was going to fall, but she wouldn't. She had a pretty severe career now, looking back on it.
As I mentioned, HD is often a family disease that people have many generations of people who may have been affected, although some of the people in previous generations may not have known initially what the condition was. And we see people coming to our clinic because they know about a family history, they know about a family member who had HD, but we also see people coming because they have abnormal movements and they don't know what they are, and they may be the first people diagnosed. So it sounds like in your case, you knew about a family history, you knew about your risk for HD, and what led you to see the doctors or your neurologist in the first place? Was it knowing about your risk, or was it your movements that led you to seek care in the first place?
Yeah, I didn't have any movements. I knew I was at risk. Everybody thought I didn't have it. The main reason I went to get tested, I was already in my late 50s and with 2 children. I just wanted to be able to tell them that they didn't have to worry about it. That was kind of the main goal. So it didn't work out as planned. I tested out at 41 repeats.
And Sue, can you, from your perspective, when did you first notice symptoms or abnormal movements in James? And do you think you noticed them before he did, or can you tell us from your observation what you first saw?
His movements initially were with his fingers and his feet. And the time that I noticed was when he had his shoes off and he's, on a footstool, and then his feet were moving around. So that's when I noticed, but he actually knew first.
You mentioned moving of the toes. It almost sounded like you were describing very mild, like fidgeting, what we might call fidgeting. And people can experience abnormal movements in, I mentioned, any part of the body. But for you, it was mostly your feet. Did it get to other parts of your body, or did it kind of remain mainly in your feet?
Eventually it did. It took a long time to get there. It did start out very minor, very slow progression, which is good. If you had to choose your disease, that's late onset and slow progression would be the way to go. So for a long time, it was very minor. If I'm sitting still, you may not notice that anything was wrong. But, of course, with my family history, I knew what it was and was concerned about it. So that's when I started to think about clinical trials. What could I do? It's a rare disease, and you want to do what you can for the greater good. And that's when I started to research clinical trials. And the one, the Austedo trial was coming up in Boston, which isn't too far away, and seemed like a good fit for me.
James, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to participate in the clinical trial for Austedo?
Well, I knew that I tested positive, and Huntington's is a rare disease. Not everybody wants to participate in clinical trials. But in a case like a rare disease, you can't wait for somebody else to do it. You have to, if you're eligible, you have to really do what you can to help the greater good. And I would encourage anybody who's eligible for a clinical trial to pursue them. There are numerous ones out there. And also be sure that you talk to your care team about any trials before you go into them, so everybody knows, including your neurologist and your primary doctor.
He had just really noticed his chorea. So I think he was really interested in looking at clinical trials that might help with that, right? Yeah. So, and at the point that he was looking to do the Austedo clinical trial, I remember it very distinctly. I mean, he's there on the computer. I'm, next to him at the table. He says, "Oh, there's a clinical trial for Austedo for movements." I went, "Well, do you have movements?" And it was like, that's when I realized, and he told me, "Yes, I do have movements." So It was very interesting. We were just really glad that he was eligible to be a participant.
Well, as someone who works with the HD community, I just appreciate everybody who is willing to devote the time and energy to participating in a trial. So thank you for participating. Can we shift gears and can you tell us a little bit about your real life experience in using Austedo, both in terms of benefits and side effects that you've had in your real life using it?
Well, I started taking it during the clinical trial. Technically, I think I was on the placebo. They do let you know. It goes from the low dosage of 6 milligrams up to 48, the maximum dosage. And then once you go through all that and you complete the trial, they give you the opportunity to stay on the medication so they can continue to study you. Again, I was experienced some side effects. They really didn't seem that bad. Sleepiness in the afternoon, that kind of thing. I did have some restlessness that popped up at one point. They reduced the dosage and it went away.
And how about after the trial? Now, assuming you're still using the Austedo, if you can tell us about, have you noticed any effect on your Chorea? And are you still having any side effects?
Yeah, there are some side effects. As you mentioned, sleepiness is probably the number one. A lot of times in the afternoon, I'll feel tired, take a quick nap with the dog, and I'm a lot better off after that. The other side effect I had, and it's on the list there, is the restlessness that occurred. Very uncomfortable. You can't really sit comfortably. All of a sudden you're jumping up and going around the house. So it was distressing. At that time, they went down on the dosage a little and it went away. One thing that Chorea will do, and it did for me, is my feet would move when I'm lying in bed, making it more difficult to fall asleep. So the Austedo does help with that. We've noticed just this summer going to the beach, I have less movements there. Last summer, my feet were moving around a lot. And this summer, they're not, a lot less. So that's a good thing.
Basically, his movements have been in his feet and his fingers, and he's just started to get a little unsteadiness. But there is a difference. There is a difference. So we have noticed. So when his feet started to move some more, that's when he upped the dosage, because he was on I think 9 and 9 for a while and then went up. But it's real important, I think, the flexibility. That is great, because everyone's different.
And Sue, can you tell us your observations about what you've seen different with the Austedo?
Well, I think, I just have known him. Well, I've known him a long time, 50 years. So when he started the movements, he started with being on the clinical trial. So for our experience, which each person's experience is different, I noticed a difference with it getting better. And in the beginning, I actually took a video of his feet, because I'd see the feet on the footstool, and I took a video of the feet moving. And then once he was, on the Austedo, and it would, titrate up. And then I took the video again, and it definitely was less movement. So I've seen a distinct difference. At this point, he has started to be more walking, a little more movements, and maybe he needs some speech therapy. As I said, each person's different. Each patient's different, which you're a doctor.
And I imagine we have a lot of care partners listening to this as well. So as a care partner, can you tell us just what your role has felt like in his HD care, how you've supported him, and if you have any advice for care partners?
Well, basically, you're in it, 24/7, and you're with your partner. I'm still in love with my best friend and my soulmate. We met when he was younger, and So you go through life and you experience challenges, and this is something that we're experiences, and it's each day is different. So you have good days, you get, not so good days. But I think it's important to support your loved one, be involved with them for all their decisions professionally, have the best care team you can. I think it's really important for people out there who have loved ones with HD to go to a real experienced HD professional center. Because they know the best treatment plan for your loved one that's affected by Huntington's. Also because there's those, good days and bad days, and you're supportive. I mean, I support him, with the medications, make sure he takes that. There's some things that, he would rather me do, make the appointments, do the phone calls. So also, it's important for you as a caregiver and care supporter to be supported yourself. So it's important for you. I know I go to a support group every month, sometimes twice a month, and share, confidentially my experience and get support from them, and I can support them. If there are support groups out there, you can do it virtually, and you should have a support system, with the family and friends, and enjoy each day. I mean, each day is precious, and just enjoy it and have fun.
That's great advice and really inspiring. And with that, I just want to give you an opportunity to both of you, if you have anything else you'd like to share with people about HD and about managing Chorea.
One thing I would say is if you do have Chorea, you may not even know it. You should consult your doctor, your neurologist, your care team, and the caregiver, of course, is part of that team. And Sue is so important, as she mentioned, and as my caregiver, she couldn't be better. I could go on, but you have limited time. But I did want to say that. And she helps so many others in the state as a volunteer with HDSA, that she'll take a call on a Sunday and talk to somebody for an hour. It's seen it happen many times, and give them the advice they need and point them in the right direction. And it's so important. So I just did want to point that out.
James and Sue, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your story with us. We really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.